A routine morning in the parking lot of a luxury apartment complex turned into a nightmare when Maya Collins, a black woman, was stopped and arrested by racist police without any apparent reason. What the officer didn't know was that the woman he insulted and handcuffed that day wasn't just anyone. She was a supervising police chief, and she had the authority to expose the rot festering behind the badge he wore. The deeper Maya dug, the clearer it became. He was just a pawn, and the hand moving the pieces on this board had never shown its face. Can Maya take down an entire system? Drop a comment where you're watching this, and don't forget to follow the channel so you won't miss what comes next. There was a faint scent of mint drifting from the rows of elm trees, a smell only longtime residents would recognize. Clean, expensive, and ever so slightly aloof. The granite-tiled lot was spotless, almost too pristine, its polished surface reflecting the dim floor lights like still water. Space so perfect that even the smallest disturbance would scream. In the thin mist still hanging in the morning air, Maya Collins emerged slowly from the underground garage, dressed in a fitted athletic set that showed off a body built from strength and discipline. The kind of physique that made it clear she wasn't someone easily pushed around. She had earbuds in, listening to a podcast on justice reform. The host's slow, deliberate voice echoed in her mind. Have you noticed how most ID checks in wealthy neighborhoods target people of color? Maya gave a small, wry smile. She didn't need anyone to tell her that. She had lived those numbers her entire career. It should have been a morning like any other, if not for that sound. Barely a sound at all, faint, subtle, but her ears caught it. The slow roll of tires on stone. No siren, no engine growl, just wheels turning, quiet and deliberate, like someone was watching. She didn't turn around. Her steps remained steady, shoulders relaxed, chin held high. Only her spine straightened just a bit more. As she neared the Audi, she glanced to her left, her eyes briefly flicking across the side mirror. Reflected in the glass, she saw it. A city patrol car following at a slow crawl. Close enough to feel intentional, not close enough to be considered aggressive. Inside the cruiser, Brent Walker sat upright, hands poised on the wheel, alert. His face gave nothing away, but his eyes were sharp, knife-sharp. The kind of look worn by men who believe they know more than they really do. He studied Maya like she was a stain on a white shirt, something that didn't belong here, that didn't match the setting. Maya took a slow, deep breath, keeping her heartbeat steady like she always did before big meetings. But this wasn't a meeting. This was a test. And the man behind that wheel, with his rigid face and heavy stare, was confidently stepping into a game he thought he understood. She kept walking. Didn't get into her car just yet. Her pace slowed like she was waiting to see what would happen next. The patrol car didn't drive away. It rolled forward a few more meters, then stopped completely. Just 3 car lengths away, Brent didn't get out. No lights. No window rolled down. He just sat there, watching. Maya knew this move. She'd seen it, investigated it, handled dozens of cases just like it when she ran internal affairs. But this was the first time in years that she was the target. A breeze swept through, carrying the scent of jasmine from the balconies above. Maya stood still, one hand resting on her car key, the other loose by her side, but ready. The wind brushed her cheek like a whispered reminder. This fight never ended. It only changed form. And this time, Maya wasn't a distant observer. She was in it. The patrol car finally moved, breaking its cold, silent watch, and rolled toward Maya with deliberate intent. She stayed exactly where she was, standing beside her car, unmoving. The surrounding air was still, with no sound except the slow crunch of tires over granite. Soft, but unmistakable in the quiet of the morning. A warning without words. The cruiser pulled up close, cutting her off at the curb. A subtle move, but calculated. Block the path. The door opened. Brent Walker stepped out in full uniform, his movements sharp, contained. Not rushed, but with the quiet readiness of someone who'd run this scenario 100 times before. His hand hovered near his belt, eyes locked in, posture rigid. It was a stance Maya had seen many times in her life, but this time she was the one on the receiving end, not the one watching from behind a surveillance feed. He didn't greet her, didn't ask if she was okay, didn't offer any explanation. He just stood there, facing her, as if her very presence was a situation that needed fixing. His eyes swept over her, scanning every inch, hunting for a detail out of place. No name badge? No resident tag? Walking instead of driving out? A quiet inspection but obvious? He was just waiting for Maya to slip up, so the process could move along faster. "I need to see your ID," Brent said finally. There was a pause. Maya didn't move. Her hands stayed by her sides, no reach for a pocket, no signal of cooperation, just a single question, light as mist. "Am I being accused of something?" "We got a report," he replied. "Someone suspicious hanging around the parking lot. You match the description." "What description?" Maya asked, her voice steady, not raised, not softened. "Black woman, in the area, wearing athletic gear. Looked suspicious." She tilted her head slightly. "That wasn't a description, it was a pretext. A shape molded to fit an action already decided. I walked from the garage to my car, listening to a podcast, not sneaking around." She said it like she was reciting a time-stamped surveillance law. Brent frowned. There was something about Maya's calm that unsettled him. He was used to flustered reactions, nervous explanations, maybe anger, maybe pushback. But this stillness, this silence, as if he were the one being watched, began to gnaw at the confidence he wore like armor. "I don't want to escalate things," he said, stepping forward half a pace. "But you're not cooperating." "I'm simply asking for a valid reason for this check," Maya said, her voice steady and unchanged, so calm it might be mistaken for indifference. But her eyes told another story. It was sharp, alert like a blade tucked inside velvet. The officer, now leaning slightly forward, didn't respond immediately. He stared at her a beat too long, as if he were trying to calculate not who she was, but what she was, what kind of person, what social layer, and how easily she could be pushed. "Do you live here?" he asked, the question coded in feigned neutrality. Maya and the officer both knew that wasn't a question asked of everyone. It was for people like her, the kind whose presence in wealthy spaces always seemed to need proof. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she tilted her head as if catching something in the breeze. Then, without challenge or submission, she replied, "Do you ask that to everyone or just me?" The wind picked up, brushing dried leaves across the stone and lifting strands of her hair over her shoulder. Maya stood still, unblinking, and for the first time something flickered behind the officer's eyes, an involuntary lift of his brow. She wasn't afraid. She didn't flinch or rush to justify herself. He straightened his posture and tightened his tone. "I'll say it again, I need to see your ID. If you can't prove you live here, I'll have to bring you in for verification." The wind didn't stop. It moved like a soundtrack behind them, rustling through the elms above. On the ground, neither of them moved, the space between them frozen in place. The officer still clung to his role, the one who dictated the rules. But the longer the moment stretched, the more his role started to feel out of sync. Maya wasn't reacting the way he expected. She didn't protest, didn't explain, didn't try to defuse the situation. She stepped entirely out of the script. Brent could feel his pulse shift. His mind scrambled to build a scenario he could control. If she continued to refuse, he had the right to escalate, right? He just needed something, anything, to justify it. A misstep, a moment of defiance, a reason to call her suspicious. He adjusted his radio, pressed the button on his shoulder, and spoke in the polished tone he'd practiced over years of protocol. Requesting backup, possible subject refusing identity check at Bridgeview Heights parking, suspected non-resident. Just a few seconds of audio, but enough to set the frame. If things went the way he wanted, that recording would hold weight, and if they didn't, it would still be something, enough to tilt the paperwork against her. She heard every word and didn't interrupt, didn't flinch. She let him finish, let the narrative write itself, thread by thread. Her silence wasn't passive, it was precise, the kind that forces the other person to hear themselves and realize what they sound like. It got under his skin. Brent's expression twitched, half confusion, half irritation. He stepped forward again, the gap between them now barely a meter. He leaned in, not to whisper, but to apply pressure. "You realize you're making this harder than it needs to be." His voice came through his teeth, clipped and brittle. Maya didn't answer. No nod, no shake of the head. She simply tilted her head slightly to the left, studying him like an unfamiliar object pressing into her space. It was a small gesture, but it made Brent's spine prickle. His hands clenched, knuckles whitening. He still knew, rationally, that everything was being watched. At least one camera, maybe more, had eyes on him. But he could feel his control slipping, and with it, the image he was trying to hold together. He was angry, not just because he couldn't control the situation, but because he couldn't control her. Brent straightened up, but his calm was gone. He tried to lower his voice, but couldn't hide the shake in it. "All right, then. Do you want to play stubborn? We'll do this by the book. I'm requesting a physical search to establish identification." When Maya finally spoke, her voice hadn't changed at all, clear, firm, and free of anything unnecessary. "You don't have that authority," she said, eyes locked on him. "I'm not under arrest. You don't have a warrant. I'm unarmed. A body search isn't permitted in this situation. I know the procedure very well." There was no sarcasm in her tone, but to Brent it landed like a slap. She didn't raise her voice, didn't lecture, but every word struck clean and hard like she was documenting the moment right in front of him. Not with ink, but by standing there, steady, unshaken, unbowed. Brent's neutral expression faltered. His jaw locked, his brow pulled tight, and a low growl rose from his throat. He had thought he could shift the dynamic, maybe with professionalism, maybe by pressing until she gave him something, but now he realized he wasn't the one in control. Heat surged through him like a steam building under a sealed lid, and then, in the space where reason took a step back, he acted. Brent lunged forward and grabbed Maya's wrist with a force that had no justification. No warning, no added explanation. He yanked her arm behind her back, twisting her shoulder unnaturally before slamming her forward against the gleaming black hood of a nearby car. Maya didn't scream. She exhaled, short and sharp, as her wrist twisted and her body tilted under the force. Her back hit the cold metal. Her cheek turned sideways to avoid the windshield. She didn't resist, didn't shout, didn't tense in defiance, but the way she endured it, silent, tearless, refusing to beg, only made his action feel more naked, more exposed. He cuffed her. The click of steel locking into place echoed across the lot, sharp against the whispering wind. A window on the third floor burst open. A man's voice shouted down, urgent, furious. "She lives here. I know her." Brent didn't look up. He kept his hand on Maya's shoulder, his breath uneven, his gaze twitching. That voice, one single line of confirmation, was enough to flip the narrative completely in the eyes of anyone watching. But he wouldn't allow that. The anger burning in him now wasn't for Maya. It was for himself, for letting it go this far. for being unraveled not by a woman who yelled or fought, but one who simply wasn't afraid. And that, more than anything else, made him feel threatened. Brent no longer thought about protocol, or the camera overhead, or how this story might be retold. Everything was clouded by a single growing obsession: make her submit. He tightened his grip on her shoulder. Too hard, far beyond what was necessary, as if brute strength could compensate for the power she'd just stripped from him. His fingers dug in, not to secure her, but to assert something, to leave a mark. No one had ever looked at him the way she did, not with defiance, not with desperation, but with a full, unshaken presence. People he stopped, black or white, usually tried to negotiate their way out as quickly as possible. But not Maya. She didn't back away. She stood her ground, as if daring him to follow it through to the bitter end. And that was what he couldn't stand. Not the challenge to authority, but the unmasking of the role he'd been performing. He shoved her into the back seat of the patrol car like a mannequin, but in that brief moment just before the door slammed shut, her eyes caught his, and something inside him stuttered. There was no rage, no contempt, no fear, only recognition. She had seen him, clearly. She knew this wasn't about the law anymore. This was personal, a failure of control disguised as enforcement. Brent slammed the door harder than he needed to. The metallic thud echoed cold and final across the silent lot. He stood still for a second, chest heaving, realizing his hands were trembling, not from fear, but from knowing, deep down, he had crossed a line he couldn't step back from. A black woman, in a wealthy neighborhood, standing tall, citing the law, refusing to shrink, now cuffed right outside her own home for a reason no one would dare say aloud: prejudice. He shoved her toward the cruiser, each step a desperate attempt to reclaim authority that had already slipped away. Maya walked with him, didn't resist, but never surrendered. The cuffs restricted her arms, but not her presence. Her eyes, though no one could see them now, were wide open, sharper, more focused than ever. The door opened. Brent said nothing. He forced her down into the seat, rougher than necessary. The door slammed shut with finality, like a one-sided declaration. Above them, figures stood watching from balconies, phones are still raised. One had started live streaming. Below, Maya's canvas bag lay near the heel of her shoe, forgotten. From inside, the podcast was still playing, soft and steady, the host's voice floating up through the static. And sometimes, staying calm is the strongest act of resistance in an unfair confrontation. Inside the patrol car, the air thickened like a room with no windows. Maya sat in the back seat, hands cuffed in front. Brent, in his unraveling control, hadn't even followed standard procedure. She didn't move, didn't speak, just leaned back against the worn leather bench, her eyes fixed through the blurred mesh panel separating her from the front cabin. Up there, Brent sat behind the wheel alone, hands resting but motionless, as if frozen. His posture was rigid, statue-like, but the small betrayals of his body, his quickened breath, the tight press of his lips, the subtle twitch of his wrist, revealed a storm brewing beneath the surface. When the car finally rolled forward, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Maya didn't meet his gaze. She sat upright, her head tilted slightly, eyes following some distant point beyond the window. Something outside this moment, detached from him entirely, and that, more than anything, dragged Brent deeper into the hole he had dug himself. He began to speak, voice low but cutting through the hum of the A/C. People like you think you can live there without drawing suspicion? No answer. Maya didn't turn. He continued, his tone now laced with something bitter, not the clipped authority of a cop, but the voice of a man quietly threatened by a reality he couldn't comprehend. You've got a house, a car, in that fancy place, but you still act like the world owes you something. You look at me like I'm the one who doesn't belong. You think someone like you got there because of what? Hard work? Silence. Only the soft tick of the turn signal as the car merged onto a wider road. Maya didn't flinch, didn't respond. But beneath the sleeve of her long top, the smartwatch on her left wrist was still recording. A small red indicator light tucked neatly behind her wrist bone is invisible. It didn't need to be seen, it just needed to be remembered. Brent exhaled sharply through his nose as if waiting, hoping for a reaction. He was provoking her, nudging her toward that familiar edge where people snap, where they yell, fight back, lose control, so he could say, "See?" She wasn't cooperating. But Maya didn't give him that moment. She didn't hand him the role of victim in the twisted story he was trying to rewrite. Instead, her voice came low and sure, a sentence shaped by patience, observation, and restraint. "You're going to regret this before the day is over." The words weren't loud, they carried no venom, but they landed in the cabin like a drop of black ink spreading across white paper. Undeniable. They didn't need to be explained. They didn't need to be repeated. Brent checked the mirror again. This time, something in his eyes faltered. A part of him wanted to mock her. Another wanted to understand. But beneath that, beneath all the bravado, was fear. Fear because she wasn't afraid. Fear because she refused to play her part in the script. Fear because for the first time he felt like he was being recorded, not by a body cam, but by someone whose memory wouldn't let him disappear. He let out a laugh, awkward, forced, as if to shake it off, as if to reassure himself this was all just empty talk. But his hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. His pulse beat faster, and on Maya's wrist, the watch continued its quiet task, logging every word, every breath. The car turned onto the highway, heading toward the South Precinct. Brent accelerated, trying to slice through the tension with speed. But the faster he drove, the more the air in the cabin pressed in around him, dense and suffocating. Streetlights thinned out as the car drifted away from the main roads. The engine's hum grew louder in the quiet, no longer drowned out by the city's white noise. Maya didn't look out the window, but she noticed the change. The route wasn't leading toward the police station like it should have. At a key intersection, Brent had turned right instead of left, away from Southgate Avenue, which would have taken them directly to headquarters. She knew exactly where this road led, the old industrial zone, decommissioned since 2012. That place had once been the center of an internal investigation Maya had led into a series of evidence-tampering cases before the area was sealed off. A dead zone. No cameras, no pedestrians, no public lights. "You're taking the wrong route," she said, her tone calm, steady, not panicked. "The precinct isn't this way." Brent didn't respond. His head tilted slightly, eyes flicking through the rearview mirror like a blade that avoided hers on purpose. Emotionless to the point of seeming artificial. The absence of expression was a sign in itself. This wasn't spontaneous. It was calculated. Maya knew this pattern. Officers who stepped outside protocol, but masked it with the silence of routine, as if not saying it out loud made it somehow legal. "This isn't a mistake anymore," she continued, voice measured like she was documenting the moment. "You're deliberately taking me somewhere without witnesses. Every minute you prolong this, you're adding charges to your own file." The car jerked off onto a side road, cracked with potholes, where the broken silhouettes of streetlights leaned like ghosts. Ahead, the shell of an abandoned warehouse came into view, its tin roof torn, its walls patched with mold and graffiti, ringed by rusted barbed wire. Brent pulled over. He didn't turn off the engine. He sat there for a moment longer, not thinking through the next steps, but trying to control the small part of his conscience still squirming in his chest. He stepped out, walked around, then yanked open the back door, where Maya sat. "Out of the car," he said, no pretense of official tone now, just a raw command. Maya didn't ask why. She stepped out, hands still cuffed in front of her. Her eyes scanned the area. Dark, wide, deserted. She took 2 steps back and stood still, meeting his gaze as if the streetlights were still on and she had nothing to hide. Brent opened the passenger compartment and pulled out a crumpled folder. He drew out a printed form, a pre-SIL incident report for obstruction of duty, with blank spaces for a statement and signature. "Sign this," he said, his voice flat as if reading from a tired script. "You failed to present ID, refused to comply, interfered with an officer during duty. We'll get this over with quickly. You can go after that." A fabricated confession ready to sanitize the arrest. If Maya signed it, she'd be officially admitting to criminal conduct, something that could destroy her career, her record, and the reputation she'd spent over a decade building. She looked at the paper but didn't touch it. Her voice was composed, solid, not pleading, just stating the obvious. "You're asking a handcuffed detainee taken off route, held in a location outside your jurisdiction, to sign off on actions that never occurred. You know what's wrong." Brent didn't argue. He just let out a bitter laugh, like someone who'd heard too many people quote the law at him. But what he didn't say, what he couldn't control, was the slight twitch at the corner of his eye. Maya stepped forward. Her gaze didn't leave his. "To writing your own indictment right now. There are no public cameras here, but I don't need them. I've got a GPS location. I'll know your name and your patrol number, and I have me. When this story comes out, I won't be labeled an anonymous bystander. You won't be able to erase me." She paused for a breath, then finished, her voice dropping low. "And you know I'm telling the truth." Brent took half a step back, still holding the unsigned report. The pressure was gone. The orders are gone. For a few seconds, his eyes seemed to lose their focus, like he was debating whether to keep playing a game that had already slipped out of his hands. And for the first time that morning, he felt something he couldn't shake, an unbearable tightness building inside him. He'd done this before, more times than he could count. Black women, young black men wandering too close to gated communities. The moment he stepped out of the cruiser in uniform, the reactions were almost predictable, panic or anger. Both were easy to handle. The panicked ones folded fast. The angry ones gave him all the justification he needed. Subject escalated, officer had to restrain. It all fits inside the perfect loop. Stop, question, report, search, detain. He'd never imagined he could lose control of that cycle. But Maya was different. She didn't rage, she didn't tremble, she didn't talk much, but every word hit clean, stripping away layers of the armor he'd built over the years. Her resistance wasn't loud, it was methodical, procedural, and undeniable. Every move she made was by the book, so much so that he couldn't challenge a single step. Every time she stepped back, she pulled him closer to one fact. He was the one unraveling. Brent couldn't explain why her calmness rattled him so badly. There was something about her, something that made him feel smaller. It wasn't power, not physical strength, not open defiance. It was that quiet kind of confidence that only comes from someone who knows exactly who they are and knows they can't be easily broken. And that made him furious. Not just at her, at himself. Furious that he couldn't force her to feel what he'd made so many others feel. Fear. He knew, if this thing ever blew up, he had ways out. He could tweak the report. He had higher-ups who'd back him if needed. There were countless examples in the system to prove he wasn't an anomaly. But right now, in this dark, empty place with no cameras and no one watching, he couldn't bring himself to move like he used to. Something in Maya's gaze made him pause, as if he were facing someone entirely outside his playbook. A gut instinct. She wasn't ordinary. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just a mind game. She was performing, playing some psychological trick. A black woman with degrees, a nice house, a luxury car, couldn't possibly have that much power. That's what he believed. That's what he always believed. But that belief, ironically, made him feel even more insulted, more cornered. Here he was, a white officer, in uniform, armed with a patrol car, handcuffs, and state-sanctioned authority, and yet he felt like he was the one being dominated by a black woman who didn't shout, didn't resist, didn't flinch, just stood there and looked at him. That feeling, the contradiction, was like a dull blade pressed into his chest. It didn't slice, but it burned under the skin and made him want to scream. He crushed the incident report in his fist, jaw twitching. In his head, the scenarios started spinning. Force her to sign, restrain her, wipe the GPS, call for backup, every option. A play he'd run before. Brent stood frozen in the dark, his breath sharp and uneven. The incident report crushed in his left hand while his right curled into a tight fist as if trying to hold back something boiling just beneath the surface. He glanced at Maya. The woman still standing there, cuffed at the wrists, hands in front of her, posture impossibly composed, and that only deepened the shame rising in his gut. He was the one in uniform. He was the one with the authority to question, to search, to detain. He represented the law, a system he believed would always protect him, even if he pushed past the lines now and then. But in Maya's eyes, there was no fear, no pleading, no regret, only a mirror, one that reflected the ugliest parts of himself. And that mirror was driving him mad. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Brant snapped, his voice scraping the air like metal grinding metal. "Just because you know a few damn laws, you think you can stand there and tell me I'm breaking them? You're nothing. You're just another black woman in cheap athletic wear wandering around a rich neighborhood before sunrise. You don't think that looks suspicious?" Maya didn't respond right away. She looked at him like she was waiting for him to finish, revealing every last rotten piece of himself. Then she tilted her head slightly, her voice calm, blade sharp across still water. "Are you talking to me or yourself?" Brent narrowed his eyes. Maya continued, her tone still stripped of defiance, almost clinical, like she was reading facts into a file. "I wore workout clothes because I was running. I came from the garage in the building I live in. I wasn't wandering. I have a resident pass. I'm on the lease. There's security footage of every step I took. And there was no report, just the bias in your head. Bias about skin color and status." "Don't get self-righteous with me," Brent shouted, stepping forward, now less than a foot between them, his face flushed red. "You think you're better than me? Do you think you're clean? People like you love this little intellectual superiority act, and when it blows up, you cry about police overreach?" Maya didn't flinch. The skin around her wrists was red from the cuffs, but her eyes were clear, sharp, unshaken. She spoke slowly, every word striking like a drumbeat in the silence. "I don't need to be better than you, I just need you to be accountable." Brent staggered just slightly, like the words had struck something deep inside his pride. And in that exact moment, he broke. Rage flared through him, hot and wild, crawling up his spine like fire. On impulse, without thinking, he raised his hand. Maya saw the motion before it happened. She recognized it, the posture of violence. She didn't move. She didn't need to. She had anticipated it. She was ready. His palm struck her left cheek, hard. The slap echoed cold and sharp in the hollow space of the abandoned warehouse. It bounced off the rotting walls like a sentence passed. No need for a judge, no jury, no camera. Just the smartwatch on Maya's wrist. Still recording second by second since the moment she'd been cuffed. The blow didn't drop her. Her head turned from the impact, then slowly returned to center. Her cheek began to burn. Her left eye narrowed slightly, a natural reflex. But she didn't speak, didn't cry out, didn't fight back. She let the silence do the rest. Brent froze where he stood, his hand still suspended mid-air like a man stunned by his reflection. It wasn't guilt that stopped him. It was the realization that he had crossed the final line, the one even his colleagues, the ones used to cover for him, couldn't ignore. If it ever came to light. On Maya's wrist, the small red light blinked, steady and unfazed. The device kept capturing everything. The sound of the slap, the contact of skin, the sudden stutter in his breath, and the silence that followed. A silence louder than any scream, and in that moment Maya knew. She had enough. Maya tilted her face to the side, registering the stinging aftermath of the slap. Her left cheek had begun to swell, the pain pulsing with every heartbeat. Still, she didn't reach for it. Her hands were cuffed, and more importantly, she didn't need to. The evidence was already stored in the small device snug against her skin, and every second had been silently transmitted. A breeze swept through, carrying the scent of rust and dust from the abandoned industrial zone. For a brief moment, the space between them thickened, dense and tactile. On one side stood a man who had crossed the line. On the other, a woman who knew she no longer had to say anything at all. Maya dropped her gaze, her posture folding slightly as if she'd finally given in. She exhaled, stepped back half a pace, eyes lowered like someone who had just lost the last bit of hope. Her shoulders sagged, no longer braced, and her steps stumbled lightly as Brent motioned her back toward the cruiser. She didn't resist. Brent exhaled with relief. In his mind, her silence meant submission. Her defiance had crumbled, he thought. Control, the thing he feared losing most, was once again in his grasp. "Finally figured out your place, huh?" he muttered under his breath, loud enough only for her to hear, then opened the car door and shoved her inside like she was just another inconvenient piece of evidence. He didn't care about covering his tracks anymore. He didn't need to. Years of routine had taught him that violations were buried under reports full of euphemisms, supported by the quiet complicity of the system. One black woman, no matter how smart, couldn't possibly stand against all that. To Brent, this was just another morning of disturbance handled by the rules he and others like him had always quietly rewritten. He started the engine, pulled away from the dead lot, and headed for the station. The sky had turned a dull ashen gray. The morning sun, buried behind a thin veil of clouds, cast no warmth. The road ahead looked longer than it should have. In the back seat, Maya leaned her head against the window, eyes gently closed. She said nothing, no more legal arguments, no more statements. But her left wrist, still cuffed in front, rotated slightly, just enough to trigger the immediate upload function. Within seconds, the entire audio log, from the first words exchanged in the parking garage to the slap in the abandoned lot, was transmitted to a private server she'd set up long ago. Across town, on the third floor of the city's central precinct, Internal Affairs Chief Dana Whitmore sat at her desk. She had just received an urgent ping from the security protocol she and Maya had established for solo supervisory field ops. She opened the file. The audio unfolded in sequence. Brent's voice demanding ID, the insults, the strike, and the deafening silence afterward. Dana's expression darkened. She leaned back, crossed her legs, and tapped her chin, a quiet rhythm she always fell into when about to make a decision. She knew Brant Walker too well. A textbook officer, on paper, always by the book, dodging responsibility with surgical precision, shielded more than once by sympathetic supervisors. But what he hadn't known, what he couldn't have known, was that this time, the woman he tried to break was the one person who could bring down everything he'd relied on. Back in the patrol car, Brent smiled as he pulled into the precinct lot. He didn't spare Maya a glance. In his mind, all that was left were a few routine steps. Get her processed, pressure her into signing the form, and close the case. Maya didn't say a word. She let him guide her into the reception area, head slightly bowed, shoulders lowered, as if broken. A few other officers glanced over. One let out a low whistle at the sight of the cuffs. Another nodded at Brent with quiet approval. He thought, same as always, nothing to worry about. But in a small room not far from where he stood, Dana had just pressed a button on her desk, calling an emergency meeting. Everything was shifting. And Brent had no idea the game he thought he controlled had just flipped. The glass doors of the station swung open with a sharp mechanical chime. Brent walked in with a confident stride, gripping Maya's cuffed arm like a trophy. His police boots struck the polished floor in stiff, heavy beats. He didn't look at her, but every movement radiated the swagger of someone convinced he'd just scored the decisive point in a long-running game. Behind the front desk sat 3 officers. One young man focused on paperwork, the other 2 looking up at the sound of the door. One of them glanced at Maya, brows tightening slightly. Brent ignored the stares, his voice clipped and matter-of-fact. Female subject, late 30s to early 40s. Refused to present ID. Obstructed an officer at Bridgeview Heights, requesting intake for verification and temporary holding. Maya said nothing. She stood still, hands cuffed in front of her, eyes steady. There was no fear now, no trace of the submissive posture she'd adopted in the car. What she projected now was something else entirely. Someone waiting for a witness to arrive. Brent turned to the young officer at the computer. Make sure to note, subject displayed provocative behavior, refused cooperation, suspected of unauthorized residency. His tone was flat and mechanical, like he was reciting SKUs off a shipment form. Wait a sec. The young officer hesitated, casting another look at Maya. Are you sure? She doesn't seem like that type. Brent scoffed, leaning in to drop his voice. Don't let the look fool you. I've handled plenty just like her. But before he could finish the thought, a voice cut through the room, low, sharp, and commanding, slicing through the air like a blade. Brent Walker. Every head in the room turned. Down the hallway stood Dana Whitmore, dressed in a dark pressed uniform, the silver star on her collar catching the overhead light. Her gaze was cold steel. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to introduce herself. Her presence alone brought the room to a standstill. Brent froze. For a moment, his lips pressed into a hard line. His grip on Maya's shoulder loosening slightly. He hadn't expected Dana to show up. At least, not so soon. Chief Whitmore, he started, one hand still on Maya's arm, clinging to the illusion of control. I just detained a suspicious individual. I've got evidence she refused to comply. Dana didn't let him finish. Remove the cuffs. The command wasn't loud, but it hit like a gavel. No hesitation, no ambiguity. No one moved. Brent's face tightened, throat bobbing as he swallowed. Ma'am, I thought... No, Dana cut in, eyes never leaving his. You didn't think. You didn't verify. You didn't ask her name. You saw a black woman in a wealthy neighborhood and projected your bias onto her. Brent turned slowly toward Maya. She stood as she had the whole time, upright, unblinking. Her silence was no longer the silence of a victim. It was the stillness before a moment she'd already prepared for. An officer stepped forward and unlocked the cuffs. The soft click echoed louder than it should have. Maya brought her hands forward, rubbing her wrists where the metal had left its mark. Then she stepped calmly to stand beside Dana. Brent's eyes followed her, confusion now clouding his face. And then Dana said the sentence that dropped the whole room into stunned silence. "She is Maya Collins, supervising police chief for the state." No one spoke. Someone dropped a pen. Another officer stared at Maya as if they'd just been told a ghost was real. Brent stood there, jaw slack, unable to speak. His blood pounded in his temples. The slap, the taunts, the forced submission. It all shattered in his head. This wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't just an overstepping procedure. He hadn't humiliated a random civilian. He had assaulted the one person who could take down his entire career with a signature. Dana stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Maya. In her hand was a file, an official transcript of the recorded audio. She didn't need to open it. She didn't need to hold it up. Brent only needed to see it to know what it meant. "Every word you said, every move you made has been recorded," Dana said, her voice even and cold. "And it now lives on a secure server in the Internal Oversight Division." Brent's shoulders curled in. His mouth opened, but only nonsense stammered out. No excuses, no defense, just breath tangled in panic. The confidence was gone. The posture collapsed. And worst of all, he could feel it. Everyone was watching him, not as a colleague, but as a man about to be investigated. The emergency meeting room, already thick with the usual tension of performance reports and silent hierarchies, now felt suffocating, as the air itself had curdled into smoke. No one spoke. Eyes darted toward one another, then quickly away. Sweat bloomed beneath stiff collars, and hands that had long since grown numb to weapons now twitched subtly on the table as Dana placed her phone on the control panel and connected it to the room's internal audio system. "I need everyone to hear this." Her voice wasn't raised, wasn't sharp, but it had weight, an authority that didn't need force to be obeyed. With one tap, the audio file began to play, and Brent's voice filled the room. At first, he sounded like any officer, measured and controlled, but it quickly devolved into something sharper, uglier, mocking, accusatory, laced with venom. "You think people like you can live there and not raise suspicion? You think someone like you got there by hard work?" And then it came. Clear, crisp, undeniable, the sound of the slap, as sharp and final as a gunshot. No one mistook it. It wasn't static, wasn't a technical glitch. It was violence. Undeniable. Direct. There was no excuse left to offer. A breathless stillness fell over the room. The whispering stopped. What remained was the sound of throats tightening, hands clasping together, eyes frozen. Dana didn't say another word. She pressed a button, and the big screen behind her came to life with a resident's cell phone footage, grainy but clear enough to show Maya slammed against the hood of a car, her arms forced into cuffs, with no sign of resistance. Every movement from Brent stood in direct violation of department policy regarding the use of force. As the video played, heads slowly turned toward Brent, who stood in the center of the room, as still as stone. His eyes jumped from face to face, desperate to find someone, anyone, who might throw him a line, a defense, a distraction. But no one moved. No one stepped in. No one even looked sympathetic. For once, the silence wasn't complicity, it was withdrawal. Dana stepped forward, calm and deliberate, her gaze locked on Brent. Not like she was looking at an officer, but like she was seeing for the first time the man behind the uniform. "Brent Walker," she said, voice clear, "as commanding officer of this precinct, I am placing you on immediate suspension from duty." She raised her hand. A younger officer approached, face pale and jaw tight, and with one firm motion removed Brent's badge. Another officer, this one someone who'd shared a desk with Brent for 3 years, walked up and retrieved Brent's service weapon from his holster. Still no one spoke. No one met his eyes. Brent didn't resist. His throat worked like he wanted to speak, but nothing came. The fire that had driven him to dominate, to humiliate, had been smothered completely under the weight of Maya's steady gaze. She stood behind Dana, silent, expression unreadable, not smug, not victorious, just still, like a sheet of ice covering a lake deep with memory. Her presence now said more than any charge ever could. It said, "I saw you." She had warned him, clearly and calmly, never raising her voice. But Brent hadn't listened, or maybe he just didn't believe her. He didn't believe that a black woman like her could hold this kind of power. Didn't believe that someone who looked like her could ever be the one to bring him down. Didn't believe that the tiny silent watch on her wrist could record the end of his career. But now he had no choice but to believe. The rest of the room stayed rigid. Officers avoided Brent's eyes, but they also avoided Maya's. Because her gaze no longer belonged to a victim. It belonged to someone who had always known what they'd allowed to happen, and that terrified them. Not just because Brent had fallen, but because deep down they knew, if the investigation went wider, their silence might come back to haunt them. The jokes they laughed at, the punches they ignored, the reports they never questioned, all of it could now become evidence. One older officer leaned toward another and whispered, "If this gets out, the whole precinct's gonna get dragged." His partner swallowed hard, eyes darting between Dana and Maya, neither willing to say a word. Dana placed the suspension form on the table in front of Brent. "You will be investigated by an independent board. If there's no evidence to the contrary, you will face a minimum of 3 charges." The atmosphere shifted. A young officer, once among those who laughed at Brent's off-colored jokes, now sat motionless, eyes down, hands trembling slightly above his keyboard. Another officer slowly unbuttoned his uniform jacket, expression blank, as if watching his own future collapse with each word of the audio file still echoing in his mind. Because they all knew Brent wasn't the only one who'd crossed the line. He wasn't the only one who'd used power like a weapon. But today, silence wasn't safety, it was proof. And they were afraid, not just of being caught, but of what it would mean if Maya Collins ever turned her gaze to them. The room stayed silent, but something had broken. Brent was escorted out, each step he took peeling away another layer of illusion from a system that had long protected him. Maya didn't follow. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough. Justice didn't have to roar. Sometimes it only needed to be heard. And today the world had listened. Maya remained where she was, unmoving, her eyes on Brent, not out of anger or pity, but with the quiet recognition of someone who had seen this before. Only that time, she hadn't been able to stop it. This time was different. This time, she had ended it. And everyone knew this game wouldn't be played again. Under the pale white lights of a nearly emptied conference room, Maya stood silently by the window, staring out at the vacant parking lot below. Everything seemed quiet now, settled even. But inside her, a different storm was rising. It wasn't the satisfaction of victory, nor the relief that Brent had been suspended, exposed for what he was. It was something deeper. Something older. His downfall had cracked open a memory she'd buried for 3 long years. A fracture she thought time had covered over, but one that ripped back open with the force of a single, familiar injustice. She remembered the name clearly. Derek Myers. A young officer, articulate, composed, and skilled at saying the right things in front of the right people. When the first complaint against him landed on her desk, back when Maya had just been promoted to Deputy Chief of Oversight, she'd read it carefully. A middle-aged black woman had reported being pulled aside and detained by Derek for over 20 minutes, while simply trying to park and pick up her granddaughter. No resistance, no contraband, no aggression. but Derek's report stated she had exhibited evasive behavior and signs of agitation upon being asked for identification. He wrapped his actions in textbook language. Every word was technically within policy. Maya had called Derek in. She remembered his face, slightly tense but not defensive. He'd spoken with calm sincerity, claimed he'd misread the situation and said he was willing to apologize. Then he'd said something that gave Maya pause. "I grew up in South Bronx, Chief Collins. I know what racism looks like. I'd never intentionally do that to anyone." And Maya, still believing then that remorse was worth something, gave him a second chance. She didn't open a disciplinary file. Instead, she invited the woman in and arranged a mediation, hoping to repair harm with goodwill. She thought, maybe what the system needed wasn't punishment, but education. A month later, Derek Myers beat a 14-year-old black boy into unconsciousness for refusing to show ID while sitting on his grandmother's porch. Surveillance footage later showed the boy sitting alone, headphones on, holding a sandwich in both hands. No resistance, no sudden movement. But Derek had written in his report that the boy startled and fled, and acted aggressively. The boy spent 2 weeks in the hospital. His family filed a lawsuit. The press exploded. Public outrage followed, and Maya was the first to be called to account. In the emergency hearing that followed, the questions came like lashes.
You knew his history. Why wasn't he flagged? Why didn't you escalate the complaint to federal oversight? You knew he'd abused his power, yet all you asked for was a written statement and a promise. And worst of all, the one question Maya asked herself again and again in every sleepless night since, if I hadn't forgiven him, would that boy still be safe? The weight of that question haunted her. She had even drafted her resignation letter. She remembered that night clearly, sitting alone in her apartment, eyes fixed on a blank sheet of paper bearing a single trembling line. I, Maya Collins, hereby resign from the position of... But she never signed. A close friend, an attorney with the Civil Rights League, called her at just the right moment and said one thing. Resigning now would only make the system breathe a sigh of relief that it finally got rid of someone who dared to see too much. Maya didn't resign, but she made a vow. From that night forward, she promised never again to let kindness become a loophole for cruelty, never again to accept an apology in place of accountability, never again to invest hope in something unsupported by truth. Brent reminded her of Derek, the way he looked at her like she was the one abusing authority, like she was the threat to order. That same twisted gaze Derek once turned on the woman he detained. And when Brent slammed her onto the hood of the car and cuffed her like she was a threat to be subdued, Maya didn't just feel pain, she felt clarity. There would be no second time. No more people suffering because of a misplaced belief in second chances. Now, as the white glow from the lot spilled into the room, Maya closed her eyes. The memory surged again. The boy's face in the ICU, the bewildered look on his grandmother's face, and the choked voice of his mother on the phone. Someone should have stopped this. Maya exhaled slowly, her hand tightening around the edge of the wooden table. She felt no regret in taking Brent down, but she felt pain for having once been a part of the mistake that allowed harm to go unpunished. And from that pain, she had carved a principle. Justice cannot be built on mercy for those who wear righteousness as a mask for power. From downstairs, the janitor's voice echoed faintly through the halls. "Miss Collins, do you still need the conference room? I'm about to clean up." Maya opened her eyes and nodded slightly. No, she didn't need the room anymore. She needed a new space. One where the real work could continue. Not for Derek, but for that 14-year-old boy, for the woman who was once pulled from her car without cause, and for Maya herself, the woman who had once stayed silent and would never be silent again.
Maya's mind was no longer in the present. It drifted somewhere deeper, into the place where all her internal fractures began, the ones that never quite healed, only layered over by duty and resolve. In her first 3 years on the force, she moved like someone holding a ticket to the wrong destination, waiting for someone to step up and say, "You don't belong here." And they did say it, just not aloud. They said it with looks, with whispers, with subtle head shakes when she entered a meeting room. When she was first appointed Deputy Internal Affairs Inspector, an older white male colleague, someone with a few more years in the system, had chuckled in the parking lot and said a line she never forgot. "That was fast. Maybe I should change my name to Malik and dust on a little bronzer." She didn't respond, not because she didn't want to, but because she'd learned by then that reacting only earned her labels: difficult to work with, too sensitive, unprofessional. Maya learned to swallow rage like swallowing ice, a sharp, cold lump that never fully melted in her chest. Time passed and the barbs evolved into subtler forms. A critical file accidentally left off her desk during a case assignment. A meeting invite mistakenly sent to the wrong address. Group lunches that she always found out about last. They didn't need to shout that she didn't belong. All they had to do was remain silent at the right moment, ignore her just long enough, and let her feel alone in rooms full of people. When she was appointed State Supervisory Chief, a position among the most powerful and visible in the system, she overheard laughter down the hallway. Someone said, "Oh, token hire. Looks great in the diversity report this year." Token hire. 2 words, short, but they carried the weight of a lifelong sentence. Not because she was weak, but because those words erased everything she'd fought for. Every hour in the academy, every overnight shift, every standoff with armed traffickers, every knock on a victim's door in the middle of the night to deliver the news no one wants to hear. Everything she'd achieved, everything she had survived, in their eyes, it was just a checkbox to make the department look inclusive. Maya had once wondered if she was being too sensitive. Maybe she was the one making it heavier than it needed to be. But then she looked again. In her graduating class, 6 white officers were nominated for advanced field training, and no one questioned whether they'd earned it. When a black officer on her team was reassigned for being a poor fit, no one raised a single concern. The system moved like a river already charted, and if Maya wanted to survive, she had to swim upstream without causing ripple. She once believed that if she worked hard enough, if she followed the rules, she'd eventually be accepted. But after all these years, she was still just her. No name, no person, just a representative, a symbol, a checkbox. What hurt most was seeing officers who abused their power be shielded, while officers of color were observed under a microscope. She had defended people like Derek, believed in their potential to change. But when they spiraled deeper into misconduct, she was the one held responsible for not seeing it sooner. And then she understood. This system, its rot wasn't just the misdeeds of a few bad actors. It was the way it protected itself through silence, through erasing dissent, through slowly suffocating people like Maya, not with evidence anyone could file in a report, but with 1,000 quiet cuts no one would ever document. Since Brent was exposed, Maya had felt the shift. Some officers avoided her gaze, others tried to grow overly friendly. But none of it mattered anymore. She wasn't here to be liked. She was here to make a change. She stood up and walked out of her office. In the hallway, light spilled across the framed portraits of past department chiefs, all white men, all posed in stiff formality beside the national flag. She stopped at the last portrait, the man who had directly preceded her, the one who once told her, "I believe you'll do fine. Just don't disrupt the system." She stared into the photo's eyes, still scrutinizing, even in print. "I didn't come to disrupt. she thought. I came to clean up. Her footsteps echoed through the corridor, firm, unwavering. She was no longer a token hire. She held the key now. And the doors that once slammed shut in her face would open this time, whether anyone agreed with it or not. Bathed in the dim blue glow of her computer screen, Maya sat alone in her office, her eyes locked on a single line of text, one that seemed to crack open a door she hadn't realized was even there, or maybe, more truthfully, one she hadn't dared to imagine existed. Want to know who's really pulling the strings? Look at the disciplinary files that were deleted. No subject line, no sender address, no trail to follow. It didn't look like an email so much as a whisper in the dark, sent from some unseen corner of the system by someone who had seen more than they were allowed to speak and who chose this precise moment to deliver it. Too precise, too timed, like someone had been watching her, tracking her every move, and now they were ready to remind her. This game was far from over. Maya's fingers flew across the keys as she pulled up the department's internal archive. With her top-level clearance in the Oversight division, she had accessed hundreds of personnel files before and led dozens of internal probes. But this time, she wasn't looking for a name. She went straight to the zone no one ever checked, the closed files, flagged as insufficient evidence, resolved internally, or worse, original documentation not retrievable. The screen filled with a list of citizen complaints stretching back years. But what made her freeze was a specific column, access status. More than a dozen cases were marked unavailable, sync error. Maya knew exactly what that meant. Not a software glitch, not a real error. It was a false flag, a camouflage created to hide and redirect. A digital sleight of hand was used to bury misconduct without leaving a trace for anyone who didn't know where to look. She didn't hesitate. She keyed in a sequence, an internal override she'd personally ordered built when she first took office, a hidden backdoor into the system's ghost copy, a secret backup she'd insisted on for data integrity pre-patch review. And just like that, the truth began to spread across her screen like an oil stain on white tile. Brent Walker, 14 complaints in 6 years. Racial profiling, excessive force, unauthorized detainment, failure to report or document arrest. One anonymous letter read, "Brent assaulted a civilian and threatened me if I said anything." 1 or 2 she could have written off as poor judgment. 14? Over 6 years? And stranger still, each file vanished from the system within 3 to 5 days of submission. Every last one marked unverified or complainant withdrew. Even though many of the originals were detailed, backed by testimony or footage, Maya leaned back in her chair, her stomach tightening. This wasn't negligence. This wasn't a mistake. This was orchestrated concealment, done too cleanly, too efficiently to be the work of one rogue officer. Brent didn't have the skill. She knew him. He was reactive, crude, and impulsive. His missteps on the street were sloppy and visible. But the digital erasures? They were clinical, intentional, structured. She turned her eyes to the top right of the screen, where each file logged the ID of the user who had last accessed or deleted it. One cold line of text stared back. ADM 19X. Maya frowned. She switched over to the user permissions registry and searched for the code. Nothing. It didn't exist. No active or archived account matched the ID. It was as if it had been created, used, and then wiped, leaving no fingerprints behind. She whispered under her breath, "No, that's not possible." She pushed her chair back slightly, instinctively seeking distance from the weight of what she was seeing. A hidden admin account, silent deletions, a pattern stretching back years, all focused on shielding Brent from consequences. And that meant only one thing. Someone at the very top built this. But the real blow came when she checked the IP log of file access. There, repeated over and over again, attached to every complaint submitted against Brent, was the same cluster of IP addresses. And their source? The office of the administrative director of the police department, a floor that had no business reviewing local patrol cases, unless, of course, they weren't reviewing. They were intervening. And suddenly it made sense. The way Brent acted with impunity, like someone with backing. His complete lack of fear when she confronted him. That attitude, it hadn't been arrogance, it had been security. Brent was the crude hand, the public face doing the dirty work others wouldn't dare do themselves. He was a pawn, nothing more. Sacrificable, forget. And when she exposed him, there had been no outrage from above, no panic, because Brent was never the real asset. He was just the skin of a machine that had been running quietly for years. Maya sat frozen, her heartbeat thunderous in the quiet room. This wasn't about an officer's misconduct. This was about a system designed to absorb, erase, and defend its own injustices. Whoever was playing this game wasn't worried about losing a few pieces. They only cared about protecting the king. And Maya had just touched the board. Beneath the soft yellow glow of her office light, Maya slowly rotated her aching wrist, fingers stiff and sore after nearly 3 hours of combing through line after line of data on her screen. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. The deeper she dug, the more she smelled something unmistakable. A stench of deception, neatly disguised under administrative procedures, buried beneath rubber stamps and innocuous file labels. Her screen now displayed a patrol assignment matrix, a grid of names arranged across every district in the city. Maya zoomed in on Bridgeview Heights, the neighborhood where she lived. Just as she suspected, Brent Walker's name didn't appear in the original dispatch. Everything seemed in order until her eyes stopped at the modified by column. A shift update logged just 4 hours before Brent showed up in the parking garage. The name next to it made her stomach drop like lead. Lieutenant Ross Avery. For a moment, Maya's heart sank under the weight of betrayal. Ross, the one person she thought was different. A rare ally, someone she had trusted. She immediately pulled up his personnel file. 8 years on the force, not a single black mark. A flawless record, so flawless it raised suspicion. He had once helped her navigate a politically charged investigation and even retrieved back-end data for her when other departments were stonewalling. Maya had believed in him, believed he was still one of the few who carried a conscience in a system built to bury. But now the layers were peeling back, one mask at a time. She dove into his access history, checking his current position and internal personnel movements. And then it hit her like a slap. An email not yet indexed in the public system. Lieutenant Ross Avery is under consideration for the role of Assistant to the Chief Administrative Officer, proposed by Director Raymond Doyle. The proposal was logged mere hours after Brent's suspension. The twist? That position had originally been earmarked for Brent. Maya's brow furrowed as she leaned back, needing distance to see the whole board. There was no doubt anymore. Ross had orchestrated the entire thing. Brent hadn't just randomly shown up in her neighborhood. He hadn't chosen that beat. He'd never patrolled that sector before. His sudden appearance, timed just hours after the shift update, was no accident. It was choreography. Ross had signed the transfer. He was the one who opened the door and laid the trap. And the more Maya thought about it, the clearer the cruel logic became. Ross had placed Brent, the volatile, easily provoked officer, in Maya's path, a man prone to aggression, a man used to abuse his badge. Ross knew what would happen. Brent would lose control, and that was exactly the point. First, Brent would be taken down. Second, Maya, usually a quiet observer, would be forced to step into the spotlight. And third, Ross would rise, positioned as the calm, clean replacement to a disgraced predecessor, already floated for promotion by the top floor. all in a single move. Ross had eliminated a rival, flushed the most powerful oversight officer in the state into open visibility, and positioned himself for a leap into one of the most strategic roles in the department: assistant to the chief administrative officer. A position with control over staffing assignments, file access permissions, and department-wide budgeting. One question now rang loud in Maya's mind. How could a mid-level lieutenant pull this off alone? There was only one answer. She launched the internal access audit tool and scanned the edit history of the patrol assignment. Unsurprisingly, Ross was the only user listed as having made the change. But what made Maya's skin crawl was what came before. A ghost IP, unnamed, unregistered, had accessed the system minutes before Ross made his change, originating from the very same building that housed the chief administrative office. And again a name surfaced like oil from water: Raymond Doyle. His office had the authority to approve emergency personnel reallocations, especially last-minute changes. And now that office wasn't just recommending Ross for a strategic promotion, it was directly linked to the conditions that nearly cost Maya her career. The web was no longer a shadow. It had form. Brent was the pawn, Ross was the successor, and Doyle, or whoever stood behind him, was the hand that moved every piece. Maya closed her eyes for a moment, letting the chill wash over her. The trap hadn't just been meant to humiliate her. It had been designed to erase every trace, while those who truly ran the game stayed hidden behind polished words like reform, transparency, and diversity metrics, a system she once believed she could fix from within. But now she knew, to break it, she'd need more than rules. She'd need to play by their rules and weaponize every blind spot they'd built for themselves. The blue light from the screen reflected in her eyes, sharp, cold, like steel drawn from its They'd pulled her into this game. But what they didn't expect was that she knew how to play. The data dancing across Maya's screen was no longer just numbers and forms. They were pieces, fragments of a machine that, when assembled, revealed the chilling architecture of one man's dominion: Raymond Doyle. To the public, his name was synonymous with reform. For over a decade, Doyle had been the polished face of progress, signing transparency pledges, speaking at national conferences on racial equity, posing with civil rights leaders beneath banners that read "Justice for All." He wore righteousness like armor, but behind the shine was a darker empire, one powered by corruption, coercion, and a mastery of bureaucratic camouflage. Maya opened one file after another. Dozens of complaint reports filed against officers for excessive force, unlawful arrests, racial profiling, and evidence tampering. Yet nearly every case vanished from the system within 24 to 48 hours of being logged. The same system note appeared time and again, handled internally, no further action required. The signatory, Raymond Doyle, or one of his 3 closest aides. She dug deeper into the budget allocation records. There it was again, in a report labeled "Enhanced Patrol Programs in High-Risk Zones." Massive spending, triple the projected amount funneled into low-visibility units. Units like the one Brent Walker had worked in. But the real sting came from the list of partner contractors for neighborhood surveillance equipment and rapid response tactical training. One name stood out: Orion Tactical, run by Doyle's younger brother. And Maya inhaled sharply, stomach knot. This was no longer about rogue abuse. This was a machine, built with one goal: to profit off the suffering of marginalized communities. Doyle hadn't just shielded officers like Brent. He had weaponized them. Arrest reports in black and brown neighborhoods had spiked dramatically over the past 3 years, the exact period when Doyle signed new contracts with Orion. The terms? More arrests meant more gear meant more budget, which meant the more people they caged, the more the system fed itself. her hands clenched into fists, knuckles white. She remembered the kids yanked from their cars for failing to signal, the women frisked on their own porches for matching a vague suspect description. Every time it had been justified by two words: reasonable suspicion. But now Maya understood. It was never about suspicion. It was strategy. A system engineered to hunt the vulnerable and convert them into quotas. She opened the department's internal event log, past conferences, and policy speeches. In one keynote, Doyle declared his commitment to removing anyone who violates the ethical code of the profession, but hidden beneath a layer of encrypted access, Maya uncovered a buried email thread, a conversation between Doyle and a local politician, discussing how to keep donors comfortable by not letting community backlash interfere with patrol productivity stats. She read every word, rage rising in her chest. Doyle hadn't just lied to the public, he had lied to the people inside the system, made them believe they were part of something noble, something changing. He'd used their hopes to build his throne, broker shady contracts, and silence dissent through a loyal web of self-serving operatives. Now it all made sense. Brent's sweat, Razu's betrayal, the timing of every move. It wasn't chaos, it was choreography. Doyle didn't need to micromanage. All he had to do was preserve the machine, protect the ones who did the dirty work, and crush anyone who stepped outside the circle. But there was one variable he hadn't accounted for. Maya didn't expect that someone who had played by the rules, who had swallowed her anger, walked the tightrope, held the line, would one day stop being quiet. He didn't expect that someone inside would finally choose to fight back. Maya typed the final lines into her encrypted note. Raymond Doyle, manipulating the system from the inside out. All evidence is now duplicated and secured across 3 separate encrypted servers. This is no longer about one man. We are facing a structure built on power, profit, and silence that's lasted for decades. But that structure has one fatal flaw. It never planned for someone to rise up. She saved the file, synced it to 3 independent servers via the internal Oversight security net. Then she stood. No hesitation in her posture now. Her eyes were no longer filled with doubt, only something sharper. Cold belief in truth. And one sentence echoed through her mind. Now you've shown your face, Doyle, and I'm done backing down. She had just saved the final line, closing one of the most decisive chapters in a battle she never asked to fight, but one from which there was no turning back. The triple backup protocols had been activated, the files encrypted and uploaded to an independent network, a safety net painstakingly built to guard the evidence she had uncovered. But as Maya shut off the screen and stepped away from her desk to head home, she had no idea the undercurrents had already begun to Now, only hours later, she stood frozen in her apartment, the one place that had once been her sanctuary, her private fortress after long days buried in shadows. Under the amber light streaming through her window from the street lamps outside, her silhouette stretched long and distorted across the frosted glass, bent, silent, drained by the gnawing weight of suspicion. Her coat still hung from one shoulder, the warmth of the day's tension still clinging to its fabric, but her eyes had gone cold and vacant, fixed on the floor, where a trail of unfamiliar shoe prints stretched from the front door to her desk. She didn't need confirmation. Maya knew. Someone had been here. No signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no alarms. But the shift in the air, the subtle disarray in a place she knew too intimately, it told her plainly. This space no longer belonged to her. Her apartment had always been clinical in its order, so sterile and precise it felt almost inhuman, which made even the smallest deviation blindingly obvious. This wasn't just a violation, it was a declaration. The room no longer felt like hers, it felt observed, touched, rearranged by unseen hands. Not to steal, but to whisper, "You're being watched." But what chilled Maya more than the footprints was the silence. Absolute. No alarms, no digital trail, no shattered evidence of violence, just a warning spoken through absence, an unspoken message that echoed louder than any threat. You're not in control anymore. She took a step back, purse still slung over her shoulder, her fingers curling into fists, as if clinging to the last shreds of agency. But at that moment, her control had been taken the moment she typed the name Raymond Doyle into her first encrypted note. Slowly, she approached her desk and opened her laptop, secured by triple encryption, paired with a secondary physical token. But instead of the familiar boot-up sequence, a single line appeared on the screen. Device reset remotely, no data found. She blinked, typed fast, accessed recovery menus, input bypass codes, everything gone. No login history, no system logs, no trace. Every file she had gathered over the past week, Brent's deleted records, Ross Avery's shadow access, the contracts leading to Doyle, had evaporated into thin air. She rushed to the steel cabinet, pulling open the concealed wall safe behind a picture frame. Inside, a titanium USB stick 7 layers of encryption, her last resort physical backup, still rested exactly where she left. Her fingers gripped it like a lifeline, but when she plugged it into the reader, only one line blinked back at her. Encryption key compromised, drive corrupted, data unrecovered. The air in the room thinned. Maya could no longer hear the wind outside, nor even her own breath. It was as if every sound had been sucked from the world, leaving behind only the heavy beat of her heart, pounding in her ears like a war drum on a battlefield stripped. She moved numbly toward the bathroom, desperate for cold water to shock herself back into clarity, but as she entered, she stopped. There on the mirror, a faint streak cut through the dust. Someone had wiped it clean, just enough to leave a single sentence, scrawled in dull red ink. No one touches Doyle without losing something. In that instant, nothing felt accidental anymore. This wasn't a warning. It was a statement. A taunt from the shadows, not screamed but whispered. No blood spilled, no doors broken, just the erasure of it. The theft of certainty. The reminder that the enemy was already inside, dismantling her piece by piece, forcing the question, "Who's still on my side?" Maya bolted from the room and pulled out her phone, dialing the one person she trusted beyond Dana, Kevin Liu, the cybersecurity expert who had helped her build the hidden ghost network. But instead of his voice, the line rang once, then again, and "The number you are calling is currently unavailable." She redialed, this time to his office line at the department. A colleague picked up, his voice hesitant, confused. Kevin was placed on temporary suspension this morning. There's an ongoing internal inquiry. Something about a breach of high-level protocol? I don't know the details. Maya froze. Kevin was the most meticulous person she had ever worked with. There was no way he'd make a rookie protocol mistake. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a stake. Sharp, deliberate, aimed not at her body but at the foundation that made her dangerous, her preparation. Her legs gave out. She collapsed onto the cold wooden floor, back pressed against the wall, the now useless USB still clenched in her fist. A faint strip of light from the street lamp outside crept through the window and landed across her face. Quiet, hollow, as if every voice inside her had gone silent. For the first time since this battle began, Maya felt truly alone. Not because of betrayal, but because she had finally seen the true face of her. It wasn't Brent. It wasn't Ross. It was something far more insidious. A system capable of reaching into her home, erasing her existence with surgical precision and leaving not even a whisper behind. This was no longer a fight for justice. This was a silent assassination. No bullets, no arrests, just the clean, suffocating efficiency of erasure. She clutched her head, fingers digging into her scalp as if she could claw the panic out of her mind. She wanted to scream, to smash the bathroom mirror, to run anywhere untouched by Raymond Doyle's shadow. But there was nowhere outside, or the shadow was everywhere. From the living room, the television continued to broadcast, calm, detached, indifferent to the unraveling of her life. A news anchor's voice floated through the air. In an ongoing effort to advance police reform, Director Doyle announced further funding for local units to enhance data transparency in arrest procedures. Maya let out a hollow, bitter laugh, a flawless performance, a theater of justice. Out there, he was still being praised. And here she was, curled in darkness, holding a dead drive and memories that no longer existed. The apartment fell into a strange stillness. The wind outside stopped. The hallway light flickered, dimmed. Maya glanced toward the balcony. The lights in the courtyard below had gone out at some point. It felt like the building itself was ling, watching. She tightened her grip, fingers cracking from the pressure. She couldn't break, not now, not after they'd finally shown their hand. No one touches Doyle without losing thing. She repeated the phrase, not to succumb to fear, but to engrave it, to remember, because if that was the price, then someone out there would have to pay it too. Maya turned her gaze toward the night beyond the window, and this time her eyes were no longer empty. The night hadn't fully fallen, but Maya had been wrapped in darkness for hours. After sitting in her compromised apartment for what felt like an eternity beside a dead USB and a chilling message scrawled in red, she no longer believed any corner of that once familiar space was truly hers. The walls didn't feel like shelter anymore. They felt like eyes. She left not like someone going home, but like a fugitive escaping a trap, custom built to crush her. Now, a few hours later, she sat in a weathered cafe tucked beneath overgrown trees behind the administrative block, a place so outdated, so forgotten, that no one from the system ever seemed to set foot. The scent of burnt coffee mingled with old wood and the lazy creak of a ceiling fan overhead. It was the kind of raw, honest space she hadn't found in polished buildings or manicured conference rooms for a long time. She sat in silence, the chill of that corrupted USB still ghosting her fingertips, her eyes fixed on the woman across her. Dana Whitmore, head of internal affairs, and one of the last people Maya still trusted. Dana didn't ask if Maya was okay. She didn't do. It was written in Maya's gaze, a gaze that had once stared down death, loss, and betrayal, and still refused to close. There was no rage in those eyes, no dramatics, just something sharper, harder, like steel forged under. Maya hadn't fallen. She had simply pulled back to choose her next strike more carefully. The two women sat across from each other, the pale light spilling over the rough wood table as survivors reunited after a blast. No words were wasted. They both understood. This wasn't a conversation. It was the first move of a plan that, if miscalculated, would erase them both without a sound. Dana didn't posture, didn't preamble. She slid a slim folder across the table. Inside were unofficial records, emails, notes, whispers on paper, threads, leading back to Raymond Doyle, the man Maya had traced through a labyrinth of deleted data. The contents weren't admissible in court. Not yet, but they were far too aligned to be coincidence. As Maya flipped through the pages, she understood why Dana had chosen silence for so long. Every clue pointed not to a man, but to a system legalized by compromise and cloaked in prestige. Doyle didn't need to micromanage wrongful arrests or tactical abuses. He simply had to uphold a structure in which loyalty was rewarded and power was preserved through quiet obedience. Once, Dana had tried to investigate him. When Maya asked, Dana didn't answer with words. She simply nodded and took a slow sip of coffee, her eyes drifting toward the streetlights just beginning to glow outside the fogged windows. The partners she once worked with, Dana said in few words, had all been removed, transferred, silenced, or forced to walk away. One of them had disappeared completely just days before handing off critical documents to the governor's chief of staff. That was when Dana understood. Survival required knowing when to step back, not to surrender, but to endure, to live to fight another day, for a different moment, a better one. And now that moment had arrived, because Maya refused to. For the rest of their meeting, Dana and Maya pieced the board back together. Brent's downfall had only been the opening move. Ross, the man who placed him there, was never a mistake. He was the next pawn chosen to step forward. And the one pulling Ross's strings was none other than Doyle. By setting a trap for Maya, provoking her and pushing her into the spotlight as a troublemaker, they hoped to neutralize her. Quietly, but Maya didn't bite. And that single refusal had destabilized Doyle's entire chessboard. Dana proposed a plan, simple but dangerous. They would make it look like Maya had stepped down. All public-facing investigations would halt. Those watching Maya would think she'd been defeated, removed from name. Dana herself would file a formal disciplinary inquiry, a show of Maya's failure written in the language the system trusted most, bureaucracy. Maya listened without interruption. Dana expected resistance, a flash of anger, maybe disbelief at the thought of being painted as weak. But when she finished, Maya simply nodded, then closed the folder in front of her like closing a door she had no intention of reopening. It wasn't a submission, it was recalibration. She didn't need to say much. Everything was already visible in her eyes. Not burning like before, not hot with fury like when she confronted Brent, but cold, sharp, and steady. The silence of someone who no longer needed to shout because she had finally mapped the entire maze. And that kind of silence was far more dangerous than any outburst. Then Maya said one sentence. Just. But it was enough for Dana to understand everything. Then we won't use the law. We'll use what they built to crush them from within. The words didn't echo. They landed, solid, like a fuse being lit in a room full of kindling. Because this next war wouldn't be won by the one with the most authority. It would be won by the one who understood the system's pressure points, the fault lines that had been ignored for decades. They parted without handshakes, without farewells. No gestures, no rituals, just a final exchange of looks. The kind only seen between two women who had stripped away too many masks in this profession to believe in ceremony anymore. They believed in one thing now. That night, Maya removed every personal device from her apartment. She rerouted her digital footprint to an isolated network and contacted two former tech analysts, both of whom had once been dismissed for internal reasons, but had since built a covert monitoring grid that operated beyond department control. She knew this was no longer about investigation. This was infiltration. No longer about rebuttal. This was the reconstruction of truth from the fragments left behind by a machine that thrived on erasure. From this moment forward, nothing she did would be written into official logs. Nothing would be protected by the policy. But that also meant her enemies couldn't track her by their usual means. No more memos, no more courtrooms, no more trails. She had once knocked at the door of the system, hoping it would answer with justice. Now she would enter through the back, silent, precise, and unrelenting. Beneath a night sky heavy with humidity, the city lights blurred behind a veil of mist. Maya stood alone on the rooftop of the apartment complex. The wind ran through her hair, carrying the faint scent of smoke from a distant barbecue and the damp bite of concrete after early rain. Her light jacket rippled with each gust, and in the dim urban glow she seemed to fade into the skyline. Still, unwavering, part of the darkness yet separate. She hadn't spoken publicly in days. Since the meeting with Dana in that tucked-away cafe, every trace of Maya's movement had appeared to all. She'd stopped digging into internal files, stopped mentioning Doyle in meetings, and even formally informed the department she was stepping back from direct investigations to prioritize mental health. A decision met with nods of concern and quiet, knowing glances, like the system's most defiant wild card had finally learned to kneel. But that was just camouflage. In those silent nights, Maya had been working relentlessly offline, alone, in a space no one knew existed. Dana had smuggled in the salvaged Ghost Drive data to a fresh external device, one encoded with protocols used only by 3 members of the independent Oversight work. Maya had quietly reconnected with 2 former internal affairs officers, men erased from official records after probing contracts tied to Doyle. Their names hadn't been spoken aloud in years, but their silence had never meant surrender. Piece by piece, the web was redrawn. A sprawling map now covered the walls of a rented room, registered under a false identity. Brent had only been the exposed surface. Ross was the middleman. Doyle, the hidden puppeteer. But Maya knew bringing Doyle down required more than exposure. It would take an attack so precise and explosive, the system wouldn't have time to shield off. And to launch that, she couldn't go in alone. Tonight, it was time to trigger the plan. She pulled out a phone from her coat, a device without GPS, with no contact list, used for one purpose only, to reach the person Dana had once hinted at but never named. Maya dialed the number, pressed the phone to her ear, and drew a long breath, like someone opening a door they knew would close behind them forever. 3 rings, then silence. A voice answered, male, gravelly, low. Calm, but I've been waiting for this call. Maya closed her eyes for a few seconds. Flashes of memory flickered behind her eyelids. The bloodied face of the teenage boy beaten into a coma by Derek Myers. The panicked eyes of residents pulled over for no reason. Brent's hand crushing her wrist against the car hood. And the cold burn of watching her hard drive wiped clean in the only place she once considered. "It's time to burn it all down," she said, voice steady, calm as water before a storm. "I'm not backing off this time." No immediate response, just the sound of wind passing faintly through the speaker, like a silent agreement. Then the man's voice dropped, almost to a whisper. "You know what this will cost you, right?" "I've already paid," Maya answered, eyes opening to stare at the skyline. Those towers glowing in glass and gold, where men like Doyle signed papers that dismantled people's hope by the thousands. "I'm ready to pay more." "Good. From now on, we won't talk on this line. You'll get a location through the old channel. Bring everything, no more hiding. Just be ready." The call ended. The screen went black. Maya lowered the phone, her hand still trembling from the residual adrenaline, but she didn't read. She raised her eyes to the sky, to the stars barely visible behind the city's artificial glow, and saw it clearer than ever. To find real light, you had to break through the manufactured one. This war was never about who was right and who wrong. It was about who had the spine to stand when everyone else bowed. And Maya, she no longer belonged to that system. She was the weight that had been cut loose, and when it fell, the impact would be loud enough to make the whole city listen. Below, someone walked the hallway, unaware that above them, a storm was quietly gathering, not with sirens, but with the kind of silence only made by people who had nothing left to fear. Maya stayed on the rooftop a while longer. Then she turned and descended the stairs. No glance back, no hesitation. Because from that moment on, she was only moving forward. And the war had officially begun. When a black woman dares to stand against a system built to silence her, can she truly change anything? Or is she just a lone flame flickering in a storm? Maya Collins isn't just a victim. She's a reckoning. A blade slicing through the polished mask of those who manipulate power from the shadows. But the bigger question still hangs in the air. Can she force the system to finally bow? Or will she become just another name erased from the record? What do you think? Should Maya fight alone or rally others like her to strike back? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear from you. And if you believe this story deserves to be seen, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss what comes next.